Thank you for joining today's talk on addressing common impediments to test automation success. Over the years, we've seen some of the same issues arise over and over again, so we wanted to highlight those and hopefully help you avoid them in your own implementations. So let's look at common impediments to test automation success that we often run into. First, it's a lack of clear vision and strategy, essentially the ever-popular ready, fire, aim approach. I'll discuss the importance of establishing a clear vision as well as the components of a good automation strategy. Next, we have the application of the wrong resources. I'm not saying anyone's resources are bad, I'm saying that we often see the application of the wrong skill sets to automation. I will discuss some approaches here that can be helpful. Next is data management. The best automation implementations can be brought to their knees by unwieldy data. We're going to discuss some techniques to address some of the more common ones. Finally, we often see reliability and maintenance issues. This usually looks like automated executions that have to be babysat because they don't run reliably, and/or spending more time maintaining your automation solution than actually testing. When people start talking about implementing automation, the conversation usually begins with tools and frameworks. The right tool and an appropriate framework are certainly important, however, they are only part of the solution and really not the place to start the discussion. If you want to be able to sustain a successful automation function, you need either to be very lucky or have a good plan. I rarely see organizations talking about the vision for automation. If I ask what they hope to achieve with automation, the most common answer is to automatically execute tests. Nothing specific about what that means or what the benefits might be. What that leads to is jumping right into picking a tool and building a framework, with no overarching objective to guide the development or the roadmap. Take the time to think about what you can achieve with automation. It will make the strategy and development of the solution much more valuable. From a strategy perspective, you first need to ask yourself the question, are we ready for automation? To answer this question, you need to look at 5 foundational areas that are key to successful test automation. First is organization. Within this area, you need to understand the following. Does the organization have realistic goals and expectations for automation? Namely, that automation is an investment, requires specialized skills, and that 100% automation is not likely. Also, you need to understand, is the right support in place for automation? Does executive management have visibility to automation? Has it been given a dedicated budget? And is it represented appropriately within the project plans or development processes? And finally, do you have the right skills? Are the resources dedicated to automation? And are they skilled in both automation technology and processes? Next area is environment and process. Here you need to ask the following questions. Where are you targeting execution of automation? And what other activities are being performed in that environment? And what's your ability to control data within that environment? Next, how well can automation be integrated into your SDLC? And first, you need to understand what your SDLC is. That's important because the way you integrate the automation function with Waterfall is a bit different from how you would do that with an Agile process. And finally, do your processes provide visibility into application changes as early as possible in the dev cycle? Moving on, we have scope and roadmap. Scope is typically something that is treated very arbitrarily, something like, I want to automate 70% of my manual test cases. I like to think about all testing-related activity, not just automating existing test cases. You need to look at how effort is expended and apply automation where it makes the most sense. Will test cases be automated? Absolutely, but probably not in the same way as they were executed manually. There's also activities related to environment and data setup that often consume a lot of manual resources. These are great targets for automation. And finally, we have technology. And I put this last for a reason. Is it important? Yes. But if you have all the other factors in place, the tool really becomes secondary. So from a tool perspective, you need to ensure that your selected tool supports your target applications. And it also needs to support your target execution environments. And by that I mean browsers, mobile platforms, etc. Typically, a lot of those expectations revolve around resources required to implement and maintain automation. These expectations often result in one of the following situations. Using existing test analysts with little or no automation experience, using developers with little or no automation or testing experience, or relying on test automation engineers for all your automated testing tasks. This isn't saying that automation makes your existing test analysts useless. In fact, if done right, you should be able to free up your existing test analysts to focus on higher value tasks. We like to implement frameworks that separate the duties of test analysts and dedicated automation engineers. It allows test analysts to focus on their strengths, creating and maintaining test cases, while allowing automation engineers to build and maintain the test code that consume and execute those test cases. This approach also provides much more staffing flexibility. If you're eventually going to extend automation to multiple applications, projects, or even business units, this model allows a relatively small group of dedicated automation engineers to support a much larger set of testing efforts. It also gives you flexibility of outsourcing the automation effort if an internal automation team doesn't align with your goals. As I'm sure anyone that's been involved in any automation at all can agree that data-related issues are near the top of the list of things that can cause implementations to go south. First, the more you can do to execute automation in an isolated and stable environment against known data, the better off you are. Of course, this is much easier said than done with the complexity of today's systems. The reality is that you're going to face data issues, and there's some techniques that you can use when designing your framework to minimize these. One common issue that plagues automation and testing in general is dynamic data. This is data that you use in your test cases that changes over time. This might be a set of login credentials that a bunch of your test cases use, account numbers, policy numbers, etc. If this data exists in dozens or hundreds of test cases, it becomes a real burden when they have to be changed. The way we've addressed this is to implement a concept we call metadata tags. This allows us to replace test case data that is likely to change with static metadata tags. The metadata tags are mapped within a central repository to the current data values. Then the framework replaces the tags with the appropriate data at runtime. When the data does change, the central repository is updated with the new value, avoiding the need to update every test case where the data is used. Dates and the need to generate data for development and testing activities is another common issue facing automation. Date-dependent functionality rarely allows you the luxury to utilize a static date in your test cases. Typically, you must use a date that is relative to the current date. In addition, efficiently creating large amounts of data for testing or other development activities is a great way to get benefit from automation. However, that benefit is reduced if you have to manually create large sets of data that your framework will ingest in order to create the required output. We've addressed both issues using a concept we call data keywords. Instead of using static data in your test cases, we specify keywords that return specific classes or types of data, but randomized to the extent we need. In this case, these keywords will give a random first and last name, a date of birth for someone between 35 and 45 years old, and an email address for the domain mailinator.com. So to use the example here, if I needed to create 1,000 records, instead of entering 1,000 rows of data, we can run the framework for 1,000 iterations, and each iteration, these keywords will return a new value. Finally, from a data perspective, we have system-generated data. This is where the system you're testing generates data that needs to be used in downstream testing activities. In this case, an order number from an e-commerce site. To address this need, we've implemented a concept we call execution context. The execution context is essentially a storage area that allows us to persist values. The values can be retrieved by subsequent test steps during the same execution or even in separate executions at a later date. This is probably one of the areas that is most commonly thought of when thinking about test automation issues, and for good reason. Many organizations spend more time maintaining their test suites than they do testing. The most common symptom is an inability to keep up with application changes. The most important thing you can do to minimize maintenance is only automate the right things. We can discuss what the right things are for hours, but to take the time to think about all your testing activities and where automation can provide the most value. And certainly don't blindly set out to automate your existing manual test cases verbatim. If they were well written for manual execution, they probably shouldn't be automated that way. Second, don't reinvent the wheel each time you look to add automation to a project. There are common things you need in every implementation that are independent of the application you are testing. Architect your framework such that these common activities form a core layer that can be reused across all your automation implementations. Finally, compartmentalize your maintenance by building modular testing functions. What those modules look like, how big or how small they are, of course depends on your application and test objectives. The goal is to be in a place where if something in your application changes, you've contained the impact to your framework as much as possible. Now, this next topic is unique to those implementing automation across multiple UI technologies. This might include legacy technologies, browser technologies, as well as mobile platforms. There's a good number of interface controls that are common across all these various UIs. One thing that we found to be a large effort over the years is dealing with the technical differences in the way the controls need to be interacted with across each UI technology. In addition, we want to gracefully handle any UI interaction issues. For example, an object can't be identified or a list item isn't present. So we've developed a common UI interaction layer that handles the differences for us. If we want to enter text in an input field, we just use a single command. The differences in how that is accomplished is handled under the covers for us automatically. The last thing I want to talk about is the execution report. We very often see execution reports that are almost unreadable by a human, filled with Java dumps and the like. Any issues that occur during an execution should be clearly identifiable with all pertinent information included, including screenshots if appropriate. It should not take an hour to figure out that your test failed because a UI object couldn't be identified. Your report should clearly outline what tests were executed, the environment they were executed in, and include the individual steps at the UI interaction level. This will aid immensely in quickly identifying issues, as well as the steps to reproduce them. Thank you for joining today's episode of QA Bytes. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me via email or social media. For Utopia Solutions, I'm Lee Barnes.